I say that it's important to know some stuff before setting out. But if you have too much, I feel that it's like me trying to tell the character who they are. I've come to all these psychological conclusions about them, and that's who they are. I'd much rather they told me. Hello, everyone. So welcome to the second masterclass of what I have termed The Mountain, the novel as a series of ascents. I would like to begin by doing a very brief recap on session one, which some of you will be going, oh no, not all that stuff again. And the other people will be saying, oh good, because I missed last week anyway. Because what I'm going to say in a recap is essentially rules that will apply to everything I'm going to be saying about this particular workshop, which is going to be focused on creating characters. So the brief recap on last week begins with me talking about the mountain. It's my analogy of how to create a novel. And I came up with this quite a while ago when, before I became a novelist, in fact, when I contemplated writing a novel, I just thought that the novel was such a huge thing. It was like a mountain. I'd written a couple of plays. They seemed like hills or even foothills to me. But a mountain was the novel. And I'd look at that distant summit and think, well, it's just too high. I'll never get up there, for various reasons, which I will carry on talking about. But then, when I started actually writing my first novel, I realized that a lot of the stuff I've been worrying about was irrelevant. And the first thing I realized was that you don't climb a mountain by jumping to the summit in one giant bound, unless I suppose you're Superman, and that's slightly different because very few novelists are Superman or Superwoman or super whatever they are. So I realized that the way to climb a mountain is the way you take any journey, by a single motion. You know, if you're walking along the flats, it's a single step. If you're climbing a mountain, it's looking up and thinking, there's that little crevice there I can reach with my finger. And you put your fingers into it and you're off the ground. So how do you climb the mountain? One finger reach, one toe hold at a time. To take it out of the metaphor, with writing, that is about understanding that writing a novel, any actual piece of work, screenplay, poem, short story, play, but I'm focusing specifically on novels here, it's a process. And understanding that it's a process, a series of stages, rather than that leap to the top of the mountain, that destination idea, is what it demystifies it for a start, and it takes away the fear of it, because you know that this particular climb up the mountain, that first climb, when you're trying to figure out what the novel is and how to do it, which is going to be the main subject of all these lessons, what you're trying to figure out is this bit just in front of you. How do I get to that finger hold? What is this moment here? And the series of moments builds and builds and builds until you get to the top of the mountain, or out of the metaphor again, you get to the end of your first draft. That is the first ascent up the mountain. Now, there's a couple of rules, which I will reiterate when you're doing that first draft. One of the rules is you remove the words good and bad from your vocabulary. There's no good writing, there's no bad writing, it's just writing. It's a wonderful thing to do, because what stopped me writing, what stops a lot of people writing when they don't understand that it's a process, is that they're not immediately brilliant. You know, they've done all this reading, they've read all these wonderful people, surely they can just sit down and do it themselves. Well, you know, it's mistaking what your heroes did in the process. Their first draft of Lord of the Rings was probably a helter-skelter affair that didn't quite work. There was lots wrong with it. Name any of your favorite books, and that's probably true. So removing the words good and bad from the vocabulary, there's no, as I say, no good writing, no bad writing. There's just writing at this stage of the process. The second thing, which applies to mountain climbing as much as writing, perhaps more so because you can actually risk your life mountain climbing, is don't look down. keep going. I am a firm believer that there's writing and there's rewriting, and they're both really important things, but they mustn't be conflated in this stage of the process, that first ascent. So don't read back much. Yeah, read back a little to get yourself going the next morning, a couple of paragraphs perhaps, but don't think, oh, I have to make this all right before I move on to the next stage. Now, some of you may already, that might be part of your process. I would encourage you perhaps to try it differently, because what happens is if you keep stopping and starting, it's like you've started a climb and you've climbed up this far, but then you think, oh, I think I'll just go back down the mountain a bit and figure out a slightly better way up there. You're going to do that at the second climb, so don't look down. And the third major rule I have around writing a novel is don't show your first draft to anyone. This is hard for some people. I can see lots of faces there writing away. Am I speaking too fast for you, Lara, Jane? People? Oh, good. Okay. You're the only two people I can see at the moment. Yes, don't show your first draft to anyone. This becomes harder when you're in a writer's group or something where it's usually the first draft that's demanded. But what I find about showing first drafts to people is that if you're following the Humphreys method of just letting yourself go and not blocking yourself, keep climbing, free climbing, there's going to be some stuff that really works, and there's going to be other stuff that maybe is poorly phrased, or you didn't quite get the idea, or maybe it's not very grammatical, or heavens forfend, perhaps it's rude. Perhaps the person you show your first draft to goes, ooh, I didn't think you thought that. Maybe it's your mother, maybe it's your sister. You don't want your mother or your sister to know about your particular attitude to this particular thing. So it's like if you have a pen in your hand and you're writing away going, oh yeah, this is good, this is good. And then suddenly this hand comes in and grabs it and goes, drop that pen, you fool, because you're writing rude, crude, badly spelled, ungrammatical things. So if you know at the beginning you're not going to show your first draft to anyone, you're well ahead of the game. Now, that's largely the rules. I suppose the other rule, which I sprang on people right at the end there and teased them relentlessly throughout the masterclass, was the secret of writing. Now, you all know the secret of writing. For those who weren't there, be prepared. You could write this down. The secret of writing. Writing is writing. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. There's all sorts of things you're going to do, which I'm going to explain to you about how to get to the point where you're just writing. We're going to discuss backstory. We're going to discuss history. We're going to discuss research in different workshops. But what I'm really getting at is that the act of writing is what produces the writing. It's stuff you couldn't have dreamed of while you were plotting and thinking and planning and doing all these things. Things will happen. I promise you. It's just the way the mind works, the imaginative mind. Now, one of the things that I did talk about last week, and I'll reiterate again because it's very important with regard to character, is the whole idea of outlining, the whole idea of writing out your plot. Now, there are wonderful writers out there who do a lot of outlining. I interviewed Evan Winter, the fantasy writer, a couple of weeks ago for VPL, and he's a real plotter. He said he writes like a 250-page outline. You know, my outlines maybe are 10 pages long because I don't actually want to know too much for the reasons that will become clear. I need to know some, and it depends slightly on the genre I'm writing, how much I need to know before I start. But knowing too much would, again, like that hand coming in and grabbing me, it would stop me actually doing the things I need to do, which is writing, which is letting, well, we'll come on to what the characters need to do. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about characters, why we love them or why we hate them. You know, I always feel that what it is that draws, or I ask the question, what is it that draws people back to a book again and again, that makes them want to finish everything else they have going on in their life, all their chores, all their engagements, all that stuff, so they can get back to the page that they left it at, the book. And there's lots of different answers. People read for lots of different reasons. There's education, entertainment, escape, And I suppose those are all the reasons that begin with E. You can go through the alphabet. There's lots of different reasons why people read. We're drawn to writers for their style, their way with words, their sense of humor, perhaps, or their ability to depict tough times and make us feel like we're there, or happy times and make us feel like we're there from the comfort of a chair. But I truly believe that what draws us back to, and it's actually true of nonfiction as well as fiction, what draws us back to a book is characters. All the other reasons seem to fold into one. If you think about some of your greatest reads, what is it that really sticks in your memory? I mean, is it the depiction of the blasted land of Mordor? I love the way Ian McKellen actually rolls the middle R of Mordor. Do you ever notice that? Mordor. He's so camp, so English. Anyway, Mordor. Is it the description of the blasted road, or is it the dilemma Frodo finally finds himself in? I suspect you've all read it, but is he going to throw the ring in or not? Is it the intricacies of espionage, of codes and dead letter drops and stuff like that when you read Jean le Carré? Or is it the moment when Smiley realizes that the traitor is someone he's loved all his life? I think it's characters. And as I say, it's probably as true for nonfiction as fiction. It's the journey that another human takes that rivets us to it. How they overcome their enemies, their obstacles, a word I will return to a lot, and how often the enemy is within themselves and their obstacles are self-erected. So how do you write characters? What is the alchemy that makes us have such feelings for people? And it's not obviously necessarily love, because some of the greatest characters in fiction are the ones we hate. But they're people caught up in usually extraordinary circumstances. Extraordinary for us, even in the most basic of novels that's set in something very recognizable. There are people caught up in circumstances often that test them or are somewhat beyond their control. So again, when I'm talking about anything to do with this, I'm going to keep coming back to that word, process. How we create the characters is often a series of experiments, and experimenting with words, with characters, with how to depict them is a good thing. Every writer really has their own way of doing that. I mean, some write elaborate histories detailing every moment that the character has lived from the cradle to the grave. I say that it's important to know some stuff before setting out. But if you have too much, I feel that it's like me trying to tell the character who they are. I've come to all these psychological conclusions about them, and that's who they are. I'd much rather they told me. And I know that can sound a little sort of esoteric, but it's truly not. The characters are going to tell you who they are. And they're going to really tell you by action, by character in action. That's in action is 2 words, because character in action would be a really dull novel, right? So before I get onto the main business of that, of how I believe compelling characters can be created, I'm just going to quote a couple of major laws here around characters. And these are from 2 different writers. The first one is I will confess I'm not a great reader of writing books, manuals for writing. I read the odd one when I was first beginning. One was really about how to get out of your left brain and get into your right brain. But I'm not, all these books on writing, I don't tend to read them, partly because I'm so busy writing my own stuff. And it's not that there isn't great stuff out there. When I read some of the stuff, I go, I should read more of this. But one book I highly recommend is this one, and it's called Into the Woods. And it's by a man, I don't know if you can see that, but it's by a man called John York. I'm not sure it's available straight off the bat in Canada. Perhaps it is. But it's subtitled How Stories Work and Why We Tell Them. And it's a wonderful book about writing. He's a senior producer and writer, but mainly a producer of writers at the BBC, and has his own production company, and he's got a string of credits. But he's really done a great job of analyzing. And what he's also done at the end of the book, which is quite funny, he's analyzed all the other writing teachers and said, this is what they say, and this is what I say, and this is why they're talking rubbish, and oh, this is not bad. But he does go into the idea of what story is and why we tell them. And really, he comes down in the whole, on my side of the argument, which is it's about character. So his one rule that I gleaned from many of his is this: the central character has an active goal. They desire something. If they don't, then it's almost impossible to care for them. The central character has an active goal. They desire something. If they don't, then it's almost impossible to care for them. Now, I believe that's absolutely true. It's very hard to care for passive characters, and by that I mean characters that things just happen to. It's been interesting. My son, who's 17 and is a great student of film, he and I watch a film together every Friday night, and we're always spending a lot of time debating, whether it worked, whether it didn't, what did, and stuff. And we watched a film last week, which is on Netflix, called Hereditary. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but it's a horror film. And it's directed by this very talented young man called Ari Aster, a very alternative kind of filmmaker. Very clever. He also made the film, which you might have seen, called Midsommar. Both films are horror films. Both tend to deal with sort of the devil and things like that. Now, they're both clever films, but at the end, I was deeply dissatisfied because the characters, the main characters they focus on, don't seem to have a need apart from to escape the horror. They don't have some real drive that drives them through. And at the end, well, I don't want to spoil anything for you here, but I'll just say that I found it dissatisfying in the end because their objectives weren't clear, and this is a slight spoiler, but they didn't meet them at the end. Things happen, interesting things happen, and there's a different kind of conclusion. But I found that not satisfying, and I think that's because it violates John Yorke's rule there. The second major law I'd like to describe is a little more personal. Very short backstory to this one. Some of you, perhaps most of you, perhaps all of you will have heard of the English playwright Noel Coward, who was a very famous English, he wrote music, he wrote musicals, he wrote lots of songs, lots of poetry, mainly famous probably for his plays and his songs, I suppose. Anyway, he wrote some marvelous plays. During World War II, he was out entertaining the troops in the Middle East. And my father, who was an RAF pilot, had been a Battle of Britain fighter pilot and had got a bit old at 26 and moved on to Transport Command. And he was flying Noel Coward around. And Noel Coward was quite taken with my father. My father was a very handsome young man, as Noel Coward said in the Middle East Diaries. And also my father's father was a very famous, or quite famous actor in England. So Noel Coward wrote about him in the Middle East Diaries. And then towards the end of the war, my father was back from the Middle East and still trying to be what he was before the war, which was an actor and a writer. The apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, I suppose. And so he sent Noel Coward this play that he'd written. He was very proud of this thriller. And Noel Coward wrote a letter back that is a classic of criticism, which just destroyed the play in beautifully phrased English. But one of the phrases he used in it was this, and I have that letter, and it's I haven't actually got it on my wall here, but it's in my head. It used to be on the wall of a writing hut when I had such a thing. And Noel Coward said, "Above all, let your characters dictate your plot rather than your plot dictate your characters." So I think those are words to live by. Now, it's a little disingenuous to say that plot doesn't affect character and vice versa. Those who were there last week will remember one of my favorite words of writing, which is oscillation. I like to oscillate between the drive of the narrative and the needs of the character, between the research and what it's given me and the plot, between the research and the character. All these things you're oscillating around. And it's it's not like you're thinking of them all the time. It's not like you're doing a checklist and saying, all right, I've done plot now and I'm going to do character. It's those things are oscillating and moving around, and they all feed on each other when you're climbing that mountain for the first time, when you're building your characters. Now, I'm going to talk now about my idea of character in action. I think most of you will be familiar with the sort of the first law of writing, the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of writing is show, don't tell, which effectively means the author doesn't tell us what to think of this person. He's a really bad guy, trust me. He reveals how bad that villain is by having him, stomp on a puppy or something, right? That's how it is. Now, it's the same with characters. Characters are revealed by what they do and they don't say. I'm not a great believer in interior monologue, unless you're trying to mislead the reader. Actually, then it's quite useful for a character to be going, well, yes, here I am, and I've always thought this about this, but suddenly this, all that. It's not terribly active. It's not terribly interesting. This is relatively, given the grand scheme of how long people have been telling stories, relatively new. Tell, not show, or tell and show, actually, was one of the big ways people wrote for a long time. You think of those 19th century writers like Dickens and Sir Walter Scott and even Jane Austen. They did a lot of revealing of stuff. They did a lot of telling us who these characters were. Lots of digressions into history, and you need to know all this, rather than incorporating those facts into the action, which is really something I'm going to deal with next week when I talk more about research. But overall, it's better to show us, not tell us. Now, we're starting to approach, I know this sounds like a very long-winded introduction, but it's all about character. We're starting to approach that moment of when we're really starting to climb that mountain, when we're really starting to develop these characters. But I need to backtrack a little and talk about backstory. Because, I said I didn't outline too much. And that includes backstory. It's a bit different depending on the genre you're writing in, of course. I write both historical and fantasy. Now, recently I've started writing modern novels as well, but mainly my main output has been historical. And of course, at VPL, I'm the fantasy writer in residence. But all the rules I'm going to talk about really apply to any genre you happen to be writing in. So if you're taking historical, though, and I'm going to give you an example of my novel Plague, which some of you may have seen. It's a religious fundamentalist serial killer story set in the Great Plague of London of 1665. It's one of the books that I actually tell from sort of multi-narrator points of views. There's 3 protagonists and 2 antagonists in that particular book. But the main man, the guy we start with, is a man called Captain Coke. Now, when I did my preliminary research, and I learned the difference between my first novel, The French Executioner, 20 years ago, when I basically researched it for 6 years before I began writing it, and now when I basically researched for 2 months before starting to write, and then the story tells me what research I need to do. It's quite marked, the change there, because research, for historical people out there, can be procrastination. I'm sure you know that. But you need to get enough going. So I was researching Coke, his backstory, how he was obviously a war veteran, because most of the characters, the male characters in this book are, how they were all suffering to varying degrees from whatever the 1660s equivalent of PTSD was. And so I knew that about him, and also that he'd lost everything, that he was a highwayman, because he'd lost everything. As he said later in the book, he says, I took the only course available to a man whose education was confined to bullets and blades. So that was interesting. And the fact that he'd obviously lost a lot. He was well-bred, he was the son of a baronet, but he'd lost everything. And now he was a thief on the road. If I think about the fantasy books, my series Smoke and the Glass, which is my newish fantasy series. This book came out a couple of years ago. It's called the Immortals Blood series because it centers on immortality and a world where all these sort of different countries, in a way, within the world, all have different forms of immortals at their hearts. Basically, the 1%. It's something in the blood that happens. You know you're immortal until you die, and then you're reborn. You can't be killed in a conventional way, and you can live for hundreds of years. And my main character in one of those worlds, which was a sort of Norse world, was a character called Luck. And I wanted a character there who was not one of your major heroes. He was smallish, bit twisted. One leg was longer than the other, bit of a humped shoulder. And he was a thinker. He wasn't a fighter. In Viking world, of course, the fighters were prized, and he was much more a thinker. So that was my starting point for them. Now, so if you're at that starting point, if you know something but perhaps not too much, you're at the starting line, and the race is ready to be run, and you fire the gun. So how do we discover more about them? For me, a character is someone who needs to be discovered. If I was to immediately set down this character as if I knew him, it would be like meeting someone for the first time and thinking I knew all about them. You want to discover them. You want to see what is behind the mask. The mask itself is very interesting. What are they showing to the world? And so you get them to walk, to talk, to fight, to do things, to have sex, whatever it is. You set them into action, and then you trust that your imagination is going to come up, because, of course, writing is writing. And so it's still, remember, at this stage, I come back to the word again and again. It's a process. There's no good or bad. You're just trying to explore. I often find with a novel that if I'm starting out with a character, I'll know something of their backstory, I'll know a bit about where they begin, but it's into the process of writing that I really get to discover them. So, how to put them into action? Now, I'm a great fan of that phrase, that Latin phrase, in media res, which you might have heard. It's basically in the middle of things. So it's a good way to start a book. It's a good way to continue with a book, actually. If you need to draw, this is going into more sort of general writing ideas, but obviously what you're trying to do is hook the reader. The number one rule, when I ask people, what do you think the number one rule of any writing, of any scene is? People go, oh, character development or advancing the plot and all that. Both good things. But what it actually is keeping the reader reading. And you need to do that right at the beginning with basically a series of hooks. And one of the ways to do that is to put the character into some form of action. I don't mean it has to be a big fight straight away or anything like that, but though I have begun books with fights before. It's more to do with they're doing something, their attitude to that something, and what unfolds from there. There's a phrase I use. It's not a phrase, it's a word. It's actually an acronym I use, which I did reveal briefly last week, but I'm going to reveal it more fully and develop it more fully now. And in a way, this is something, some of you know that I'm an actor as well as a writer, and was an actor long before I was a writer. And then have somehow managed to keep both going simultaneously. No, alternately is the better way of putting that. This rule that I use, this idea, it comes a little from my acting background, and I call it Komoka. And that is COMOCA. And Komoka stands for Characters' Objectives. Meeting obstacles creates action. Characters' objectives. Meeting obstacles create action. So, as an actor, one of the things you're always taught at least I was when I was at drama school, is to, just when you're about to go on stage, what is it you want? What's your objective? You walk on stage and someone opposes you immediately. There's an obstacle. And so that creates the action. And I use Komoka all the time. It gets me out of a lot of difficulties because I'm going to dive in. I'm going to start writing and pursue this objective. And then suddenly there's an obstacle in the way, which I might not have thought of before. And there it is. And I write that. If you begin a scene with the idea of, you ask yourself the sort of simple questions: who, what, when, why, and where. Another thing about when you're writing each sort of chapter, I believe this is an interesting thing. I was thinking about this quite a lot today. Each chapter is a microcosm of the whole book. I always consider each chapter, and you might not be writing in big chapters or small chapters or whatever, but I always think of each chapter almost as a short story, that it has its beginning, its middle, and its end. Last week I talked about something as well, which I called the alphabet technique. It was a sort of mix of metaphors between the mountain and the alphabet. How much you need to know. If you think of going up that mountain also as going through the alphabet, how much do you know setting out? If you don't outline much, you don't know much. You will know A, because you're going to begin there. You might know Z, because you think that's going to be the ending. That might be dictated by history if you're writing historical fiction or some image you've had. I guarantee Z, or Z, if anyone's joining us from America, will change. But if you know A, you might know D. You might know H. It might be, as I say, dictated by new characters coming in. You know that at H, this new character is going to appear, the love interest perhaps. Kind of late H for a love interest, but anyway, you never know. And so you move between that and that. So if you think about that in terms of the chapter, the microcosm of the whole book, if that's also A to Z, you know A because there you are opening in this scene, in media res perhaps. And you let the character take you there to that next letter. You fill in B and C before you get to D by what the character does, by what he encounters. Now, I'm going to very quickly read you the opening of Plague because it kind of illustrates what I mean by this. Okay, so the first chapter begins, it's called The Highwayman. 29th of April, 1665, Tally-Ho Inn, Great North Road, near London. Just before he rode away, the captain said, "Good night, then," and touched one blackened toe, setting swift Jack gently swinging. It was a touch for luck, for sympathy, for memory. Not 2 weeks earlier, he and Jack had been drinking together at this same inn, and he'd been boasting, had Jack, about the special ineptitude of the parish constables in failing to catch his scent. "Which is astounding," he declared, "seeing as how I've not bathed since the coronation." Captain Coke had laughed, but cautioned. "Be wary, man. 'Tis a dead fox that steals too often from the same coop." But Jack had scoffed, and now he swung from a gallows in Finchley, smelling even worse than he had in life. Heeling his mount to the trot, Coke thrust his nose deep into his scarf, seeking a hint of sandalwood. The fragrance, though, had long faded, and the stench of death accompanied him for some distance. If this night's work goes well, he thought, one of my first calls tomorrow will be on my parfumier. So, it illustrates some of the points, partly because even though I wrote this a few years ago, I remember quite clearly thinking, well, I want to start him in media res. He's a highwayman. Where do I start him? I start him at a crossroads with the risk. We have the who, we have the why, we have the what, we have the where, we have the other thing, when. Well, I've said that in the subtitle of the chapter. So, beginning like that and moving through, allowing the character to lead you to the next stage, the next thing that's going to happen to him, the next obstacle he's going to encounter, the next character perhaps he's going to encounter. We know already that Coke is about a night's work. We know the risks. It's in a page. We know he's got a bit of a sense of humor. We know he's already lost people he liked. It's and it's all done as if, it's quite casually done, I suppose. And yet, but once again, I will always return to that thing that it's not, that wasn't what I wrote first, probably. My first drafts have got a lot cleaner as I've written more and more in terms of, what remains. However, that was the first stage of the process. I was beginning to understand Coke. Now, I'm going to very briefly stop because I can see the chat bar filling up, and I'm going to stop and take a couple of questions, and then I'm going to answer more questions at the end. People have been posting rules about reviews of Plague. Okay, Cairn, hello, Cairn, is saying, question on rule to never show your first draft to anyone. How do you make the writing better without input or a fresh perspective? Because you don't show them your first draft, you show them your second draft. Because the only person you need to answer to after the first draft is yourself. I'm going to digress back into that idea of the mountain and that first ascent. What I do, what I think is it's worked for me anyway, 22 novels in, is that when I get to the top of that mountain, I look down and I see the path I've taken, that free climb, that scramble. And that's when I go, ooh, I go, ooh, why did I go over there? Why didn't I go over there? Oh, I didn't follow that over that little bit over there. That would be good to follow. And I do that by, for the first time, doing an outline. That's when I do my outline at the end of the first draft. I'm going to see if I have one here to briefly show you. Yes, I do. Oh, and bizarrely, it's the outline I did for Plague probably in 2014. This is what I do for an outline. I don't know how clearly you can all see that. It's a page of butcher's paper, and I draw lines down here, which are the chapter numbers. These are the chapter titles. This is the characters and the actions here. And I go through the book. I don't actually read the whole thing again, the first draft. I go through it for each chapter. I go, oh yeah, that happened in this chapter, that happens. And I go all the way through it. And as I'm going through it, ideas will be popping up, and I write them over here. Notes. I'd set here, it says, different things. I'm suggesting different things to myself here. And that's when I write the thing. So in answer to your question, Karen, the first input or the fresh perspective you get is your own. The second draft, which I'm going to come on to in a later masterclass, is when you start getting someone else's input. Because the second ascent up the mountain is to make the story the best you can possibly make it, and then show it to someone and have them point out where it's not so much that it's bad, it's just unclear. Okay, so I'm going to, that's a good question to have answered, but I want to now get back to character, and to say a few different things about characters. One is, I always believe you should start any book with your protagonist. I mean, I sometimes do little page intros to try to place the author in the reader in the world they're at. Whether it's a date in history or a fantasy somehow. But basically, you want to get people in media res with your protagonist. If it's multi-narrator, start with the person you feel is going to be able to begin the book best. I thought Coke in Plague, because the robbery he enacts, it's not much of a spoiler really if anyone's considering reading it, but when he goes to rob the coach where he's followed these people from London, and he knows that they have the woman has an amazing diamond necklace, and he's going to take that, it's going to buy him a lot of perfume, and we discover what he spends his money on later, which is he doesn't really enjoy spending money. But when he opens the carriage door, he discovers that the three people he was going to rob have all been murdered in a particularly gruesome and ritualistic way. So I started with him because he then leads me to the thief taker, who is the next protagonist, Pitman, who stumbles upon the carriage and that same scene of slaughter 5 minutes after Coke has fled. And then the third person we see is the actress, Sarah Chalker, whose husband is going to be, he's going to go missing, that's what I'll say. So start with your first chapter. If you can, in your first chapter, introduce your antagonist as well. And I'm going to talk a bit about villains if I have time. God, we're running out of time fast. So you get going on the main chapter, and without digressing too much, because we're still largely talking about a first draft, but I'm often asked by people, when they're talking about submissions, which is something I will also get to in the masterclass, is submitting to an agent or a publisher. People are saying, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to send them the outline, and then I'm going to send them chapter 5, because it really gets going in chapter 5. And you go, no, you're not just sending them chapter 1, page 1, first sentence. That's where you're going. Because if you're sending chapter 5 to someone in the business, they're going to go, yeah, well, I don't even care. I'm not going to read it because I need to know how this person brings me into a story. So you send chapter 1, you have your protagonist. If it's possible to have your antagonist, you do. In the case of Plague, the antagonist is not there, but a murderer has been, so that's clear. One concept I find very useful about characters is and I'm going to talk about major and minor characters, and this is a major minor character, not perhaps one of the drivers of the plot, but he can be, and that's the sidekick. We all know about sidekicks in literature. The people who have that person beside them. Hamlet has Horatio, right? Or Dracula has Renfield. A sidekick is very, very useful. A sidekick can be talked to, can ask questions to reveal plot and character, can create their own dramas, and obstacles for the protagonist that they have to deal with. In Plague, which I seem to be talking a lot about, quite soon we meet, in fact, in the next page or so, we meet Coke's sidekick, who's called Dickon. When I wrote the book, I had a lovely cat called Dickon, who alas passed on this year to the great cat hunting ground in the sky. But Dickens used to sit on my desk when I wrote, and when I came up with the idea of the sidekick. Interestingly, and this is again goes to process, and again perhaps goes to Karen's question about different stages. When I was at the top of the mountain and looked down, one of the things I saw when I'd done my outline was that Coke was pretty isolated as a character. He hadn't had a lot of chance to reveal different things about himself because he didn't have a lot of interactions with people. He was an absolute loner. And I thought, he needs a sidekick. And I came up with the idea of Dickon on the second draft. So Dickon only made an appearance. He's some people's favorite character because he's what would be called in less charitable times an idiot child. He's got cross eyes, strange teeth. Coke found him freezing to death on his doorstep the previous winter and rescued him, brought him in. He's 11 years old. He's actually smart. But he's devoted to his captain who saved his life. And he's useful to his captain as well. He and Coke between them are really the highwayman. So a sidekick, very useful. Now, the antagonist is sometimes called the flip side of the hero. At the beginning, he's the one with the strength, he or she. And the hero is the one with some sort of weakness. And gradually, over the course of the book, those two things will overlap until by the end of the book, the hero has realized his need, and the villain hopefully gets their comeuppance in whatever way they do. And I'm not just talking about major drama. It could be anything. It could be a story set on a farm. It could be a tale at sea. It could be anything. But usually there's someone who's the major opposition. And we know from our own reading how great the villains are. We love the villains. I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking I've got still quite a lot to cover. So I'm gonna kind of move through a little quicker here. Because one of the things I also want to talk about, and this feeds back to everything I was saying at the beginning about that oscillation between plot and characters. Now, I find that minor characters are very useful in terms of furthering the plot, creating another obstacle perhaps, or an interaction for our hero. And I sit down, I don't want to make this sound esoteric because I don't think it is at all. I sit down often thinking, well, I need to get in this chapter, I'm writing a World War II story at the moment, and I need to get my pilot, Billy, who's been basically shot down over Norway. His plane's crashed, he knows the Germans are going to be hunting him down, he needs to find help. And yesterday I wrote this scene. When I sat down that morning, I didn't know about this person who would pop up called Gunnar Sonnersby, who is a farmer who looks out his window and sees this man shambling. He's shambling because he's a bit hurt from the crash towards his farmhouse. And Gunnar just developed from me asking those questions: who, what, when, why, where. What is he after? What's he doing? And he's, it's revealed that the Germans just took his last cow. He's only got chickens left. His son has gone what they call på skauen in Norwegian. They'd gone into the woods because the Germans tried to conscript them all into forced labor. His wife had died 2 years before because of the war, and he couldn't get the medication. So from not knowing anything about him, I suddenly had this motivation for a man he's not part of the resistance. He just wants to get on with his life. He's got up every day at 4 a.m, he says, and to work his farm. And now he can't, even though there's not much work to do now because the farm's largely destroyed or so impoverished, he still gets up at 4 and he's looking out the window and he sees this guy. And when the guy knocks on his door and says, unless you take me in, the Germans are going to shoot me on your front doorstep, he has to make a decision: shut the door in the guy's face or let him in. And he lets him in and he helps him. Guy wasn't there before. Guy wasn't there when I woke up that morning. But he was a function of the oscillation between plot and character, providing something for Billy, my hero, for want of a better word, to react against. So, but all the minor characters, they become very important. I mean, and it's interesting because some of the minor characters, because of, again, my method of working through and telling myself the story on the first draft, I've written minor characters who suddenly will take over the book or books. There's a couple of characters in Smoke and the Glass, my fantasy novel, who I thought, we're going to ditch them by the end of the first book. And then by the end of the first book, they were so good. I liked them so much. One was completely evil old Immortal and slaughterer of babies. He was just too good to get rid of. And one was I thought was just going to be the love interest who would be dispensable. And she turned into possibly one of the main characters in the book. Right. Now listen, I've only got about 5 minutes. I basically come to the end. There's lots more stuff I could talk about. Perhaps I'll try to, I will be talking in more sessions about character, because really it's all about character. But now, why don't I see if there's some other questions out there? Are you of the opinion that all minor characters should have a story arc too? No, I'm not of that opinion. It really would depend on the size of the minor character. And it also really depends on what you mean by a story arc. I mean, if Gunnar's story arc is that he decides to help Billy and then does, then yes, he's had a story arc. But I don't think the minor characters, with some exceptions, will have that journey. Perhaps their need realized by the time we lose sight of them again. I don't actually expect to see. I'm not going to see Gunnar again, as far as I know. Maybe that'll change in the second draft. But by the time I finished with him in that chapter, he was done. Now, he'd had a little arc within that chapter, I suppose, gone from non-resistance to resistance. Maybe I'm arguing myself out of the point. It was a minor arc, I suppose, in that he'd had some growth, some change. But I don't think you need to apply that rule. and there are some characters that are even smaller than that, have less of an effect. So I think I've kind of taught myself around a bit here. I think it's up to you. If you feel that character should be rounded out, then do so. But I don't think it's necessary to, unless they present you with indisputable evidence why they should be expanded or arced. Is that a word? Okay. Laurel says, can you have 3 antagonists who are equally evil? Or is it better to have a main one like you have a main hero? Well, no, I think, evil, there are degrees of evil, Laurel, but I think that in Lord of the Rings, you have Saruman as well as Sauron, right? In Plague, I have the murderer, who I won't name, and also the leader of the Fifth Monarchists, whose name is Simeon Critch Hollow. I'm a big believer in sort of Dickensian names. Simeon Critch Hollow, who actually he becomes more important in the second book, but he's a puppeteer actually. And can they be as evil? Yeah, I think they can. You've just got to find if there's space for them, if there's space for that much evil, if you need someone that evil to create further obstacles for your character, that sort of thing. That's the most important thing to think about when considering. But there's no reason why you can't have 3 very evil people and 3 very, well, not good necessarily, but your protagonists who you're following. Paul asks, your rule to not look down. Have you ever drafted a pile of work, then left it for a year or 2, then had to go back and, well, look down? Does the rule then become only look once? That's an interesting question, Paul. I recently, my most recently completed novel is this one London Day, which is some variance from my other work because it's neither fantasy nor historical fiction. It's a modern crime novel set in London over one day, 2018, because I wrote it just after 2018, which was a very hot summer. I came up with the idea for that maybe 15 years ago. And I rediscovered that idea in a notebook where I'd written maybe 5 pages of this idea. And it was before maybe it was longer ago. It was before I really had got to grips with the idea that I could perhaps make a living from writing novels. So I then read it. It was called Ordinary Day then, rather than One London Day, because it was something that happened to a friend of mine. She, sadly for her, witnessed an assassination. Don't go into that. But anyway, so I wrote down, but it happened in a very ordinary street to a seemingly very ordinary man. So I wrote this title, Ordinary Day. I had to look down then, except I hadn't really done much work. I'd only jotted down some ideas, the basis of the somewhat skimpy outline that I would normally write. And then I began writing it. So then I didn't look down after that. So there was a little looking down just to refresh my memory of something I'd written 15 years before. I think that I've babbled on enough. I'm going to have left you with a lot of stuff. It's time. I suppose, if I was to issue any sort of summary to what we've just said, I would definitely remember that coward quote, let your characters dictate your plot rather than your plot dictate your characters. But also remember that there is oscillation between plot and character. And that if writing is writing, you'll be able to find that oscillation as you're writing. Kamoka is very useful. Kamoka is one of those things that, if you're stuck, here's something. I don't believe in writer's block. Don't believe in it. I mean, it's, there are good days and bad days, but I can, in 22 years of writing novels, I can count on one hand the number of times I've walked away from a desk thinking I can't write. Because normally whatever's blocking you is the very thing you need to knock down in order to write more. So I use Kamoka quite a lot because it's something you can do. Take your character off-piste, say. your character is now he's left 17th century London and he's in 17th century Madrid, and a thug attacks him in an alley. Write that scene. Discover something about your character, about how he deals with thugs in alleys, what language he uses, what actions he takes, how he fights, whatever. And just play with the character. Get to know your character. Take him out for a drink. Take him out for a fight. Take him out for a spot of seduction, whatever. Put your character into action and see what he, she, or they, or the monster, because I've written about dragons and unicorns in my time too. Tell me what they do. Dialogue, I'm going to point out, is something I'm going to be doing a big class on later. Dialogue is very active. It's very character revealing. What people say, what they choose not to say, how they say something. Yeah. But next week, we're going to, I hope some of you can join me again next week. Same bat time, same bat channel, for those who remember that from the 60s. And I'm going to talk really about world building, and also how to use research, which my agent, when I signed the fantasy deal for 3 books, said, "Oh, just think, you won't have to do any research." And I was, because it's absurd. Fantasy requires a lot of research. And I'm going to talk about how you use fantasy how you use research in whatever genre you're writing as a springboard for the imagination, and how that's going to power you up that mountain. All right. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you very much, Daniel and Leah, for keeping a very tight ship here. And thank you, all of you. Bye.